Hi there, this is Jim from Trek World. Join me after the break as I present a logical explanation as to why so many Star Trek fans can't agree about their favorite show. Now, if you're like me, you've probably left comments on YouTube videos and been surprised by the vehemence in some of the responses to you from Star Trek fans who don't like your Star Trek. In today's world of ad-free television streaming, it is remarkably easier to forget that broadcast television was, is, and will forever be about advertising dollars. The most lucrative segment of the American general public is the male age group 18 to 34. These are the people who are most likely to spend money as a direct result of seeing an ad on TV or something in a movie. So whenever new content is produced for broadcast, that content's main target audience must be the male 18 to 34 demographic. If it can't pull in good numbers in that area, it's going to fail. Now, this is how shows like the WWE's Monday Night Raw have been able to successfully stay on weeknight TV for over 30 years, and with a full-time schedule that does not include repeats and very few preemptions. It does this by continually reinventing itself to match the current 18 to 34 group. And that's why you have people who argue about who was the best wrestler, Hulk Hogan, Ric Flair, Steve Austin, Goldberg, The Rock, The Undertaker? Now, there are fans, as the years went by, that hate other wrestlers. They hate Hulk Hogan. They hate John Cena. Nobody really hates The Undertaker, but you get where I'm going with this, right? There's a pattern to this. The original Star Trek ran from 1966 until 1969. So in order to discuss why different fans like different shows, we need to take a look at exactly who the show was positioned for when it was being created and broadcast. Star Trek was written to appeal to people born between 1932 and 1951. That meant that when it went off the air in 1969, its targeted ad audience was 50% the silent generation and 50% baby boomers. Now, 4 years later, Star Trek came back, but this time as a Saturday morning cartoon series. Now, Gene Roddenberry and Company used the cartoon as a vehicle to continue to make the same themes and stories as the original series, using the same writers. Executive producer D.C. Fontana would say for years afterwards that the cartoon actually was years 4 and 5 of the original 5-year mission. Now, as such, the animated series, like the original, was written to appeal to people born between 1932 and 1951. But airing as a Saturday morning cartoon, the network targeted the cartoon at children born between 1960 and 1965. And children did discover this cartoon. Some of them found the cartoon, liked the cartoon, didn't even know there was a TV series. As a result, when it went off the air, its resulting audience was 85% boomer and 15% Generation X. Now, Gene Roddenberry did learn one actual important thing here, though. He found out that you could actually produce Trek in such a way that it would perform well in the targeted age groups and still continue to draw the original boomer audiences as well. Now, this would become a critical foundation for Star Trek's fandom for the next 2 decades. Now, 14 years would pass, and the world changed. We had moved far away from the Vietnam War, double-digit inflation, and well into the economic boom of the 1980s. In 1987, Star Trek returned again as a weekly television series, this time featuring a completely new cast and set in a new timeline. As the series began, a completely new distribution method was used, selling it straight into local syndication markets that had been the lifeblood of Star Trek for almost 2 decades. The targeted audience for this outing were people born between 1953 and 1976. When Star Trek The Next Generation ended its historic 7-year run in 1994, the targeted ad audience on the way out was 47% Boomer and 53% Gen X. For the first time, the Boomer audience was actually shrinking. Star Trek had truly found its next generation. Ironically, this is a 1989 TV commercial which shows how advertisers were dealing with the shift from Boomers to Generation X and how they used William Shatner, of all people, to illustrate it.
For the next generation. Your father's Oswald here. Ready, Dan?
I'm ready. You ready?
I'm ready.
Steady as she goes.
It's the new generation.
Now, with the unprecedented success of The Next Generation, and I do mean unprecedented, it not only did well in the 18 to 34 demographic when it was airing, it dominated the 18 to 34 demographic when it was aired. So Paramount decided to do something they had never considered before. They launched a second TV show just as The Next Generation had hit its highest ratings ever. This Trek was different. It featured a slightly larger cast and would show a much darker soap opera-like atmosphere that was aimed at Generation X, whose TV habits showed that they gravitated towards more inter-character conflict, and for the very first time, it would show characters somewhat like Schrodinger's cat. They were neither good nor bad until you opened it up to take a close look at the motivation at any given point. Finally, about midway through its run, they tweaked it again based off audience reactions, driven mainly by Generation X, who by this time had become the single largest group of Star Trek fans in the advertising demographic. Unlike their Boomer predecessors, they liked their characters much more three-dimensional and conflicted. At this point, however, a significant number of older fans began to lament, look, Deep Space Nine just wasn't Star Trek. In fact, it was simply pretending to be Star Trek. Now, unfortunately, this perception dogged at the series as time went on, and the show never really got the credit it deserved until much later when it was embraced by the millennial-dominated audience when streaming was introduced. For some, even today, Deep Space Nine was not only Star Trek, it was the best of Star Trek, and I count myself in those numbers. In the meantime, Deep Space Nine was written for people born between 1959 and 1981. When it ended its 7-year run, its audience going out was 43% Boomer, 50% Gen X, and 7% Millennial. Do you have a message that you would like to share with us and the Star Trek universe? If so, please call or use your comments line and give us your thoughts. Now, Paramount had made so much money off direct syndication that they decided to go into the network business for themselves, and they wanted Star Trek to be its crown jewel. For the very first time since 1974, Star Trek was airing again on network television. In order for this network to survive, not just Star Trek, but the network, Star Trek had to appeal to a growing number of millennials who were increasing in numbers as the remaining boomers left the advertising TV audience. As such, Voyager was written to appeal to people born between 1961 and 1983. When Voyager ended its 7-year run, its outgoing targeted audience was 29% boomer, 50% Gen X, and 21% millennial. This would be the last time that boomers would be represented in any key target audience for Star Trek. From here on out, the money came from other generations. Now, as expected, when Voyager ended its run, Paramount launched a new series on UPN to replace it. This would be the very first time, and the last time, that a Star Trek series would be created simply for the purpose of checking a box in the network programmer's guide. Once again, the targeted demographics had changed. For the first time, Generation X was no longer the largest target audience. The millennials had taken that position, and millennials were about to teach us that they had a radically different view on entertainment. As the series went on, it struggled with the millennial audience, so the producers looked to previous Trek for inspiration, and as such, as it went further and further along, it started featuring more and more information from previous Treks. The problem was, those Treks were not aimed at this audience, and this audience didn't really like Enterprise. So for the very first time since 1968, a network canceled Star Trek, and Enterprise simply curled up in the corner and died after only 4 years. Star Trek by this point had been on TV for 18 years straight. But the targeted demographics for those past 18 years no longer mattered in our new world. Nonetheless, when Enterprise gasped its last breath, its audience going out in the advertising field was 44% Gen X and 56% poorly understood millennial. Now, Paramount knew that if Star Trek were to continue, they needed to make a Star Trek that would appeal to a now overwhelmingly millennial audience. And they turned to J.J. Abrams, who had just come off the successful television shows Fringe and Lost, to redo Star Trek, but this time for the big screen. The goal was to relaunch the franchise by taking us back to the original Captain Kirk's Enterprise, but with a completely new cast. All custom designed to win the hearts of a viewing audience that, at the time, was 25% Gen X, 70% Millennial, and 5% Gen Z. This would be the very last time that a Star Trek target audience would have any Gen X representation. Though expensive, the movies worked. They made a lot of money, and Paramount, now CBS, felt for the first time they had a shot at getting to the hard-to-crack millennial audiences. Although many people no longer in that 18 to 34 target age group began to loudly proclaim on social media that this simply wasn't Star Trek. It is common to see comments on this channel and others, like you saw at the beginning of this video, that simply says, from 2009 onward, we didn't do any Star Trek. If you have any videos, photos, or documents that you would like to donate to us, please feel free to send them to jim@trek-world.com or submit them via the web at submit.trek-world.com. But CBS decided it was time to do a new Star Trek on TV again, and like they did with the UPN network 2 decades ago, they decided to make it their crown jewel of a brand new streaming service. The new show targeted millennials that were born between 1983 and 2004. At the current point in its run that it is today, Season 4, CBS is aiming 50-50 at the millennial and Gen Z audience. While the not Trek chants are still there, this show is performing well above expectations with a targeted audience. All new Trek from this point forward would cater to these two groups. Now notice that I said all new Trek. Star Trek Picard is an experiment. It is most definitely not new Trek. It's actually rather old Trek. Remember, Next Generation was aimed at folks born between 1953 and 1976. CBS found themselves with a rare opportunity to cater to more than one age group for the very first time. They knew this because the audience for Discovery was not the audience for Next Generation. So they took a gamble that if they could offer a second Star Trek for Star Trek fans that were not Discovery fans, this would actually bring new subscribers that had not already subscribed. So when they announced Picard was coming back in 2020, it was quite well received. And the month that Picard premiered, CBS proudly announced they had set new subscription records as a result of this one series. Now think about that for a moment. New subscription records. More people subscribed to Paramount Plus to see Star Trek Picard than had subscribed to see Discovery. Why do you think that happened? Because surviving Boomer and Gen X folks have different tastes in programming, And they literally came back to a franchise that they had felt left them behind. It was written using characters developed for people born between 1953 and 1976, but using stories developed for people born between 1984 and 2005. That leaves a lot of older Trek fans still saying it's not Trek, but they're saying that based solely on the plots. Really kind of ironic, because the plot of this season is, bad guy changes past. Crew goes in the past to undo what bad guy does. Crew come back to future, save the universe. That was done in all the Star Trek TV series, and it was literally the central plot for Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home and Star Trek First Contact. So it is science fiction, but they're uncomfortable with the storylines. But remember, Picard is not about hardcore science fiction. Patrick Stewart did not want to come back and do the same thing he did in Next Generation. He was quite clear on that. He wanted to come back and focus on characters. And we have had an absolute treasure trove of performances from Brent Spiner, Patrick Stewart, and others. And next season, the entire Next Generation cast comes back for one last swan song on Picard Season 3. But CBS has been listening, and they think they have an answer for all of our Star Trek needs. For the first time in history, they're producing a Star Trek television series because the fans demanded it. As I finish production on this video, Strange New Worlds is debuting on Paramount Plus this week as the newest flagship of the Star Trek franchise. Picard proved that all the original audiences were still out there. They just had different needs. So like an alchemist trying to turn lead into gold, CBS laid out a plan to have something for each of the 4 generations of Star Trek fans. It really is an almost impossible task, but CBS has clearly stacked the deck, featuring some of Star Trek's most beloved characters and some of current fandom's most popular actresses and actors, and they set it on the most popular setting ever, the original Starship Enterprise, and they put it in the most popular timeline ever before Captain Kirk takes the Enterprise. This has so many chances for success, but it also has just as many chances for failure if they don't handle it just carefully. We'll have to check back in the future and see how this gamble paid off. Why not? The pilot for this, The Cage, was done in 1964, and it took all the way to 2022 for this series to be picked up. Okay, so we've talked about each series and what it was aimed at. Now, what I want to do now is sort of like a little cross-reference. We're going to go back and we're going to take a look at the Star Trek television series that were aimed at 18 to 34 audiences that included the boomers. They were, of course, the original Star Trek the Animated Series, Star Trek Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager. Now for Generation X was part of the main targeted audience when Star Trek The Next Generation came out, followed by Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, and the J.J. Abrams reboot. And our poorly misunderstood millennial friends were targeted at the very end of Star Trek Voyager, Star Trek Enterprise, the J.J. Abrams reboot, Star Trek Discovery, and of course, Star Trek Picard. And our current youngest age group, the generation that will continue to take us into the future, is Generation Z. Obviously, the J.J. Abrams reboot was aimed square at them, along with Discovery and Picard. Now, the next time you hear Star Trek fans arguing about whether a specific series is Star Trek or not, keep this in mind. The 4 generational groups rarely agree about anything that they like. But consider this. The fact that all 4 groups love Star Trek tells us that maybe Roddenberry's hope for the future will still hold.